Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to be partaking in today's debate on C-84. It touches some subject matter which is, I think, difficult to talk about, but that's often the case with the Criminal Code. The Criminal Code is one of those gigantic pieces of a statute that has to cover everything that could possibly go wrong in society and figure out how we amend and correct the behavior, but also how we dole out punishment. C-84 is specifically aimed at addressing gaps in the criminal code that exist with respect to animal bestiality and also animal fighting. And specifically, there was a Supreme Court decision. It's been referenced by both the Minister of Justice and the member for Calgary-Nose Hill, RV-DLW from 2016. So specifically, there's an update to Section 160 of the code to include a more broader and comprehensive definition of bestiality, and then it moves on to Section 445.1 and Section 447 to amend it to address animal fighting, specifically, building facilities to harbor animal fighting, but also promoting or making money from the event. Now, Mr. Speaker, Canada's animal welfare laws, they have not been substantively changed since the 1890s, and that has to say something for anyone listening to this debate. Now, I do want to acknowledge the member for Calgary-Nose Hill, who brought forward a private member's bill on this issue, Bill C-388, and basically the Minister of Justice in her drafting of C-84 lifted C-388 and included it. So I think that's an acknowledgement of the work that the member for Calgary-Nose Hill has done. Now, I know she did recently get into a bit of a tussle with an iPolitics columnist on a column that he recently wrote, but he was looking at some of the statistics that exist with this particular crime. And, there's the BC Supreme Court, there's the Supreme Court of Canada case that I mentioned. There have been a few, there's been one in federal court. Even in the province of Alberta, which is home to 4.3 million people, there were 6 people who were charged with that particular offense between 2013 and 2017. So it is not a very wide-ranging crime. It's certainly an abhorrent one and one that we should rightfully close in the criminal code. But what I'm concerned about is not really what's in C-84, because I think it's going to receive, I hope, unanimous consent in this House to send it to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, but mostly what's not in it. And I also would agree with the member for Calgary-Nose Hill in her assessment of the glacial pace of justice reform by this Liberal government. This is a minister who came to power with a mandate letter from the Prime Minister that really was signaling bold criminal justice reform. And we had a series of government bills. I won't number them all, but there were 4. And every time a new justice bill would be added, it would basically, like an amoeba, swallow the components of the first one and just progressively get bigger and bigger and bigger. But they were all languishing at first reading. And then finally we got to C-75, and we finally got to some action on that bill. And I believe it's currently at the Justice Committee. But it has been a pretty glacial pace. And, I like and respect the Minister of Justice. I was our party's justice critic last year for the entire 2017 year. It's a complex subject matter, and it requires a lot of responsibility and a lot of maturity to approach it. But that being said, I have to judge the Minister on her performance, and I would not really give her a passing mark on the legislative front with respect to the promises that she made within her mandate letter. Now, if we look, I want to now move, Mr. Speaker, to a story from my riding, a story of Teddy the dog, because this really goes to the heart of what's not included in C-84. And I know that constituents in my riding are going to be sorely disappointed. I will give my support to this bill, but they are going to be sorely disappointed because Teddy the dog was one of the most brutal cases of animal abuse that the BC SPCA has ever witnessed. So in February of this year, officers came onto the property and they found an adult dog tethered by a few inches. It was standing out in the wet and the cold in a pile of his own feces, and they found a collar that was embedded in that dog's neck, which had caused the dog's head to swell to 3 times its original size, because it had been left on the dog from when it was a puppy. They had never loosened the collar. And so when the officers removed the poor animal, who the community named Teddy, they brought it to the veterinarian, they had to surgically remove that collar. It exposed the dog's trachea, a mound of infected flesh, and unfortunately, that dog passed away from its injuries. But you know, it's far too often in this country we see cases like that happening. And I know that changing our laws is not going to be the magic bullet to solve this problem, but it's one critical and key component, especially when we do have such obvious gaps in our system. And so, you know, I had a rally. There was a rally in my riding in March where, like I said earlier, we had people from across the political spectrum. We had supporters of the Conservative Party, supporters of the Liberal Party, my party, the Green Party, but they were all there united because they cared about animal welfare, and they cared that the state of our animal cruelty laws is not up to what it should be right now. And so during that rally, Mr. Speaker, I made a commitment. I made a commitment that despite the member for Beaches East York and his bill C-246 being defeated, that I would continue pressure on the Minister of Justice to close these gaps and address the shortcomings of our current criminal law. I also want to say something, Mr. Speaker. The unfortunate fallout from the case of the Teddy the dog was that some people in the community felt that they could take the law into their own hands. There was a great deal of racism that came out of it because it involved a property on a First Nations reserve. And so I also want to take this opportunity to remind constituents in my riding that racism and vigilantism have no place in our community, and that while we must always stand on guard for animal welfare and certainly prosecute those who are guilty to the fullest extent of the law, we have to let the law do its job. We have to believe in the rule under law, and that we don't support or condone in any way people taking the case up themselves. I wanted to make that very clear. Now, as I mentioned in my question to the Minister of Justice, you know, not only this Parliament but previous parliaments have wrestled with the idea of the inadequacy of the criminal code provisions with respect to animal cruelty. There have been a number of Liberal bills and New Democrat bills over previous parliaments that have dealt with this issue. Most recently, you know, I will come to the member for Beaches East York, but in the previous parliament, the great Irwin Cotler, probably one of the most revered Liberals ever, and a former Minister of Justice himself, introduced Bill C-610. It only made it to first reading, but that particular bill did go and try to make some important updates, specifically with respect to failing to provide adequate care. Mr. Speaker, if I can, when that bill was introduced on June the 6th of 2014, Mr. Cotler, you know, I just want to read into the record the speech that he said. He said, "Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise and introduce this legislation which amends the criminal code's provisions on animal cruelty. In particular, it creates a new offense of inadequate and negligent care of animals. The bill establishes an offense for anyone who negligently causes unnecessary pain, suffering, or injury to an animal or a bird, or being the owner willfully or recklessly abandons it, or fails to provide suitable and adequate food, water, air, shelter, and care for it. It also punishes those who negligently injure an animal or bird while it's being conveyed." He went on to say, Mr. Speaker, that you know that Canada's animal cruelty laws are woefully out to date, and he left it at that. We have also had, you know, the member for Parkdale High Park, Peggy Nash. She introduced a bill. I believe it was C-232 in the last Parliament. The honourable member for Vancouver Centre in the previous Parliament introduced Bill C-74 and C-277. So there has been multi-party support for getting these initiatives, but every time they seem to have run into a roadblock. So now coming up to the most recent attempt in this Parliament, Bill C-246, which was introduced by the member for Beaches East York. Now, unfortunately, I was not present for that second reading vote. I was traveling with the Special Committee on Electoral Reform at that time. I was substituting it. And we were hearing from the great people of Atlantic Canada about how great it would be to have some electoral reform. Unfortunately, the Liberals didn't see the same way, but we'll see how that conversation goes on in the future. In any case, I know that I think the member for Beaches East York acknowledged that with his particular private member's bill, it probably bit off a bit more than it could chew. It was trying to really cover so many different angles, and the more you cover in a private member's bill, the more areas people can kind of find problems and find a reason to shut the whole thing down. I know that there were concerns raised by my Conservative colleagues, especially with respect to legal activities such as ranching, hunting, fishing, trapping, medical research, and so on. And I think that there are ways to proceed with legislation that address those concerns. My wife and I have a small farming property. I come from a rural area of Vancouver Island. My constituents like to hunt, they like to fish, and many of them are farmers. I would not support a piece of legislation unless there were specific provisions in there that protect those activities. I've got some of the best salmon fishing in the world right off the west coast of Vancouver Island that I enjoy, and that's something that is a part of our heritage. But I raise animals, and most farmers will tell you that looking after the welfare of their animals is good for business. You don't want to have poor animals in poor health condition or who are sickly, and I can attest to that too. I've got chickens, I've got turkeys, I've got lamb, and when they are happy and well looked after, they do very well. It's actually in my interest, not only from a moral standpoint of view, but also from a commercial standpoint. And there's always going to be those few bad apples that give everyone a bad name, but that's specifically what this law has to be designed to weed out the bad apples, to go after those who are the poor farmers who give everyone a bad name, and so on. And the member for Victoria, when he was our party's justice critic, he is back to being the justice critic, but in 2016, when he rose to give our party's response to C-246, he did address those concerns, and he did say that, there are ways of saying that for greater certainty, you can insert clauses into the criminal code that start off with the term for greater certainty, and you can make the necessary changes. I have heard concerns during that debate from Conservatives who were wondering about the jurisdictional, the constitutional issues, because we know that provinces have their own animal cruelty laws and the federal government does. But, federal government, the supremacy of the criminal law power is something that can easily override provincial legislation to ensure that we're not ending up with a patchwork quilt, that the law applies equally in each province no matter where you live. The Supreme Court of Canada has held that valid criminal law requires a prohibition, a penalty, and a criminal law purpose, such as peace, order, security, morality, and health. So a change with respect to animal cruelty can easily satisfy all of those. Now, C-84. Here we are 3 years into the government's mandate, and I alluded to this in my opening remarks. There is so much more that could have been included in this bill, and I said to the Minister of Justice during the questions and comments that, with respect, the provisions in C-84, it's not a very big bill, it's just a number of pages. Those are very much the low-hanging fruit. I don't see how anyone in this place can raise any legitimate concerns, except the tinkering around the edges, whether some words can be modified. But the general purpose of the bill, broadening the definition of bestiality, making sure that we have an all-encompassing law going against animal fighting, you're not going to find any significant objection to that. But for a minister who said after the defeat of C-246 that the conversation would continue, that the Department of Justice would be having ongoing consultations with stakeholders, and that we would eventually, I think it led many Canadians to believe that reform was actually coming. And so when I announced to my constituents that we had C-84 and what was missing, I had to convey a sense of disappointment, because honestly I think I and many constituents and many Canadians across this country were expecting a lot more. Not only 3 years into this government's mandate, but 2 years after the defeat of C-246. And I know the member for Beaches East York has conveyed that publicly, that, you know, C-84 is an obvious choice, it's the low-hanging fruit, but there's this sort of like, what else is coming? And I know the minister, like, the Liberals are masters of the long promise. They say, well, we're continuing to engage with people, but I would not be surprised if we have to wait until the 43rd Parliament before we see some action, and who knows who will be in power at that point to deliver it. Now, my party has long supported animal cruelty measures. I've mentioned all the private members' bills that have been in there, and you know, we could have included in this legislation, I hope this is something that the Committee on Justice and Human Rights will look at, but we could have included maybe some provisions of basic standards of care. I mean, so if I look at the case of Teddy the dog in my riding, the fact that he was tethered with just a few inches and was having to basically stand in his own pile of feces, I mean, the BC SPCA has some specific recommendations that this government could take note of. Basically, they want to see that dogs or any animal that are tethered, that the 5 freedoms are respected, that, that an animal is free from hunger and thirst, that is free from pain, injury, and disease, it's free from distress, free from discomfort, and free to express behaviors that promote well-being. So that's a starting point. There are lots of suggestions out there. There are many different stakeholders involved in this issue, and this is something that the government could have taken note of. Now, as I referenced in my earlier questions and comments with the minister, I have written to her on this issue on behalf of constituents, and in my correspondence to the Justice Minister, you know, I was conveying the concerns. This was before C-84 was introduced, and, you know, conveying the concerns of my community, how many cases of animal cruelty that exist across this country, and basically that, you know, this particular case acted as a catalyst, and that people were demanding more action. The minister did respond in June of this year, and again, it was more, it wasn't really anything concrete. She did say that she would like to assure me that they are intending to review all the options to improve any gaps in protection resulting from the existing criminal code provisions. Again, something that has not been done yet. She has agreed publicly that animal cruelty is a significant social issue that needs to be addressed. And so on. So there are many public comments that come from this government that signal an intent to do something, but when we actually get something concrete like C-84, we see that that has not amounted to much. And so just to highlight how important this particular issue and why these gaps are so important, I want to talk to you about some of the statistics. Now, it was reported, I think, a couple of years ago that there are approximately 45,000 animal cruelty complaints in Canada every year, but only about 1 in 1,000 results in charges, and then far fewer in convictions. So that is a significant difference between complaints and actual action in the court system, and it speaks to me that there is definitely a need for this. So, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude by saying that we do support these gaps being addressed in the criminal code. C-84 is an important first step. The Minister of Justice can be assured that we as a caucus will be supporting this bill to go forward at committee, but we will remind Canadians that there was so much more that could be done, and it's a sad day that after 2 years we're still going to have to wait for those meaningful parts to be addressed. Thank you very much.